Rising voice. The week of the school storytelling contest arrived with a mix of fear and hope pressing heavily on Maya's heart. She had kept the flyer hidden in her notebook for days, reading it over and over again as though the paper itself carried some secret strength. At first she had told herself it was impossible, that a girl like her, small and quiet, could never stand on a stage and let the world hear her thoughts. But every time she opened her notebook and saw the words she had poured out in the lonely silence of her room, she felt a pull, a whisper that told her she was meant to try. Micah, too, would not let her forget. Every night he reminded her that her words gave him courage, that her voice was their shield, and slowly she began to believe that stepping forward might be the only way to break free of the shadows at home. The morning of the contest, the school auditorium buzzed with excitement. Parents filled the rows of chairs, teachers moved about making sure everything was ready, and students nervously clutched their papers or rehearsed under their breath. Maya sat near the front, her notebook resting in her lap. Her palms were damp and her stomach twisted into knots. She had written her piece in secret, late at night when the world around her was still. It was not just a story, it was her heart. A collection of words about courage, about standing tall even when everything around you tried to make you small. She had not told Karen about the contest, of course, and she doubted her father even remembered it was happening, but in a strange way she was grateful, because this moment belonged to her alone. When her name was called, she rose slowly, her legs trembling. For a moment she thought she would fall. But then she caught sight of Micah in the crowd, sitting beside Miss Johnson, his little hands clapped eagerly, his face glowing with pride. That image steadied her. She walked to the stage, each step feeling like a mountain climbed. The microphone looked too big, the lights too bright. But when she opened her notebook and saw her handwriting, her fear softened. She began to read, her voice shaky at first, then stronger as the words carried her forward. She spoke about a little girl who learned that silence could be heavy, but that even small voices could cut through it. She spoke about courage not being the absence of fear, but the decision to stand even while afraid. She spoke about hope being like a candle, flickering but never fully dying. The audience grew quiet, their attention fixed on the tiny girl with the trembling hands but the powerful words. By the time she finished, her chest was heaving with emotion, and for the first time she looked out at the faces and saw not pity but respect. The applause came like a wave, and Maya felt something inside her unlock. Micah leapt to his feet, clapping with all his strength, shouting, "That's my sister!" His voice echoed in the hall, and for a brief moment Maya felt like the world had shifted. She stepped down from the stage with her head held high. Ms. Johnson wrapped her in a quick, proud hug, whispering, "I told you your words mattered." Tears filled Maya's eyes, but they were not the tears of pain she was used to. They were tears of relief, of release. Back at home, however, the atmosphere was unchanged. Karen stood at the sink washing dishes, her face twisted with irritation as she asked why Maya was late. Maya answered carefully, saying there had been an event at school. She wanted so badly to tell her about the contest, about the applause, about how she had felt alive on that stage, but the words stopped at her lips. Karen's eyes were already sharp, suspicious. She muttered something about Maya always finding ways to avoid chores and dismissed her to her room. Maya carried her notebook close against her chest as if it were a treasure she couldn't risk losing. That night, as the house grew silent and her father's footsteps retreated once again to the bedroom, Maya lay awake thinking of the applause, of Micah's proud voice, and she realized something had changed forever. The silence at home was still there, but she had discovered another kind of sound. The sound of her own courage echoing through a room full of people, and no matter what happened, no one could take that away. She whispered to Micah as he drifted off to sleep. "We are not invisible anymore," and though her words were quiet, they felt larger than the walls around her. The next day, word of her performance spread through the school. Students who had never spoken to her before smiled at her in the hallways. Teachers nodded with quiet approval, and even the principal stopped her to say she had done something remarkable. For Maya, it felt unreal. She was still the same girl who lived in a house filled with tension and silence, but now she knew the world outside could see her. And once the world saw you, it became harder to remain hidden. At the end of the week, a social worker visited the school. Maya was called into the office where Ms. Johnson sat with her. The woman spoke gently, asking questions about home, about her father, about Karen. Maya's heart pounded, fear crashing against the walls of her chest. She wanted to protect Micah, to keep their small world from shattering. But she also felt the weight of her words pressing forward. Her notebook, the contest, the applause. It all told her that her voice had power, and power demanded truth. She hesitated, but then she whispered carefully, "Sometimes home is not safe." The room grew still, and in that silence, Maya realized that her voice had just opened a door she could never close again. A new dawn. The morning light crept slowly through the cracks of the old house, spilling across the worn carpet and broken picture frames. For years, the silence of this house had been heavy, a silence filled with swallowed words, quiet tears, and the constant weight of things left unsaid. But now that silence had begun to change. It was no longer an endless void swallowing their voices. It was the silence that came just before something new, like the stillness of dawn before the sun rises. In the days after the confrontation in the kitchen, Daryl began to shift in ways that both surprised and unsettled Maya. He no longer disappeared into the bedroom immediately after work. He no longer let Karen's words be the only law in the house. Instead, he lingered in the living room with his children, asking them about their day, nodding as Micah rambled about superheroes and drawings, listening as Maya spoke softly about books and writing. It was awkward at first, as though he had forgotten how to be a father. But with each attempt, he seemed to remember a little more. Maya studied him carefully, torn between the memory of years of silence and the fragile hope that he was truly changing. Karen, however, did not soften. If anything, she grew sharper. Her authority had been questioned. Her control weakened, and she resented it deeply. She muttered under her breath about ungrateful children and husbands who had no backbone. She slammed cabinets harder, criticized louder, but her voice no longer carried the same unchallenged weight. Daryl had begun to push back, not always with loud arguments, but with firm refusals. He no longer allowed her to belittle Maya openly. He no longer accepted her cutting remarks toward Micah. The walls of fear she had built over years were cracking, and though she tried to patch them with anger, the cracks only widened. The social worker returned once more, sitting at the dining table with her calm voice and steady questions. This time Daryl sat with Maya and Micah, and instead of shrinking back, Maya held her notebook in her lap and spoke with quiet courage. She did not describe every painful detail, but she spoke enough truth to make it clear. Her words were steady, her tone controlled. She explained how she had learned to find her strength in writing, how she had learned to protect Micah when the world felt too heavy. The social worker listened intently, nodding, reminding her that her voice mattered. Daryl sat with his head bowed, tears brimming in his tired eyes as he finally admitted, "I let silence do the damage. I should have spoken sooner." Maya felt something shift in her chest. It was not forgiveness yet, but it was the beginning of something like healing. Weeks passed, and life in the house slowly reshaped itself. Karen spent more time away, sometimes staying with relatives or friends, her bitterness carrying her farther from the children she had never accepted as her own. Daryl began to repair small pieces of his relationship with Maya and Micah. He helped Micah with his drawings, encouraged Maya to keep writing, and even asked her one evening if she would read something aloud to him. At first she hesitated, afraid her words would sound strange in his presence, but then she opened her notebook and read a piece she had written about courage, about how real courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to stand even when afraid. Daryl listened in silence, but this time it was not the silence of neglect. It was the silence of respect when she finished. He reached across the table and whispered, "I am proud of you, Maya." The words were clumsy, heavy with years of absence, but they landed in her heart like a promise. Micah too blossomed in this new light. He laughed more freely, played without constant fear, and looked at his sister with the same admiration, but now with growing confidence of his own. One afternoon he told her, "I'm not as scared anymore, Maya, because you showed me that being brave isn't about not crying. It's about standing up even when you want to hide." Maya hugged him tightly, tears burning in her eyes, knowing that her little brother was learning not only from her protection, but from the voice she had found. The day came when Maya stood once again on a stage. This time not for a contest, but for a school assembly, where she had been invited to read her piece on courage. The auditorium was filled with students, teachers and parents, and as she looked out from the stage, she saw not only Micah and Miss Johnson, but also her father sitting in the back row, his hands clasped, his eyes fixed on her. For a moment, fear fluttered in her chest, but then she opened her notebook and let her voice rise. She read her words slowly. clearly, each sentence carrying the weight of her journey. Each pause filled not with shame but with power. The silence in the room was not the silence of fear, but the silence of hearts listening. When she finished, the applause was thunderous, echoing off the walls, filling every corner. She stepped off the stage with her chin high, knowing that she had transformed her pain into something larger than herself. That evening at home, Maya sat with Micah by the window. The sky outside was painted with the colors of sunset, golden light stretching across the horizon. She held her notebook in her lap. Micah leaned against her shoulder. And for once the house felt calm, she whispered. We didn't just survive, Micah. We rose. He looked up at her with wide, trusting eyes and nodded. We rose, he repeated softly for the first time. The words did not feel like a wish or a distant promise. They felt like truth. And so the house that had once been filled with silence became the place where two young voices had learned to rise, where a father rediscovered his courage, and where a girl who once begged in whispers had grown strong enough to speak for herself and for her brother. The walls of fear had been shattered, the silence broken, and in its place stood something new: hope, resilience, and the sound of a rising dawn. Shattered walls. The conversation with the social worker lingered in Maya's mind like a heavy stone pressing against her chest. For the first time, she had allowed herself to speak even a fragment of the truth, and once those words had escaped her lips, there was no way to pull them back. The woman's eyes had been kind, her voice calm, but Maya had felt the weight of something larger behind every question, something like a promise that what she said would matter. She walked back to class with trembling hands, wondering if she had done the right thing, wondering if Micah would be angry with her, wondering if Karen or her father would somehow know what she had said before she even stepped through the front door that evening. That night, Maya lay awake staring at the cracked ceiling, listening to Micah's steady breathing beside her. The silence in the house was thick, but it carried a strange electricity she could not explain. She remembered the applause from the contest, the way her words had filled the auditorium, and she realized that speaking had changed her. She could no longer fit herself back into the shape of silence she had lived in for so long. It was as though she had outgrown it, and the walls of her life could no longer contain her. She whispered softly into the dark, "We can't stay like this forever, Micah. One day it has to break." The break came sooner than she expected, a week later. Karen discovered the flyer from the contest tucked between the pages of Maya's notebook. She had been rummaging through the room while Maya and Micah were at school, and when Maya returned home, she found her stepmother standing in the kitchen holding the notebook with a tight grip. Her eyes burned with fury. "So this is what you've been hiding," Karen hissed. "Writing stories, going to contests, pretending to be something you're not." She threw the notebook onto the table with a sharp thud. Maya's heart stopped. That notebook was her lifeline, her secret world, and now it lay exposed under the harsh light of Karen's glare. Micah ran forward instinctively, trying to grab it, but Karen pushed it back with her hand. "No, this is mine now," she declared. "You don't deserve to be filling pages with your lies and fantasies. You should be focused on chores, on discipline, not on wasting time with foolish dreams." Maya felt a surge of panic and anger rise inside her. She stepped forward, her voice trembling but strong. "It's not foolish, those are my words. You can't take them." For a moment, the room froze. Karen's mouth opened in shock, not used to such defiance. Then her face twisted with rage. She raised her hand as if to strike, but before it could fall, Daryl's voice boomed from the doorway. "Enough," he said. His tone was sharper than Maya had heard in years. All eyes turned to him. He stood there with his tie undone, his eyes bloodshot, but for the first time in a long time there was fire in his gaze. He walked into the room slowly, his eyes fixed on the notebook, then on Maya, then finally on Karen. "Give it back to her," he ordered. Karen blinked in disbelief. "What did you say?" She demanded. "These kids are disrespectful. They need to learn their place," but Daryl's voice was steady. "No, they need to be heard." The room filled with a silence heavier than thunder. Maya clutched Micah's hand, her heart pounding. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. Her father, the man who had lived in silence for so long, was finally speaking. Karen's face reddened. "So now you take their side?" She spat. "After everything I've done to keep this house in order?" Daryl's jaw tightened, his voice low but firm. "Keeping order is not the same as keeping peace. You've been breaking them down instead of building them up, and I let it happen. I stayed quiet, but not anymore." Karen's hand shook as she slammed the notebook onto the table and stormed out of the room, the door to the bedroom slamming behind her. The sound echoed through the house. For a long moment there was only silence. Daryl's shoulders slumped as if years of weight had suddenly crashed down on him. He sat at the table and rubbed his face with his hands. "I failed you," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Maya stepped forward cautiously, her notebook clutched tightly to her chest. "You can still fix it, Daddy," she said softly. Daryl looked up at her, his eyes wet, and for the first time she saw not only exhaustion in them, but also shame and longing. Later that evening, Daryl gathered both children in the living room. Micah curled into Maya's side. His small body trembling, Daryl sat across from them, his voice heavy with truth. "I thought keeping quiet was the best way to keep peace. I thought if I ignored the storms, they would pass. But I see now that silence is just another kind of noise, the kind that eats at you from the inside." Maya listened carefully, her heart swelling with a mixture of anger and relief. She had wanted to hear these words for so long. To know that her father saw them, truly saw them, and now he was finally admitting it. In the following days, the house changed. Not completely, not all at once, but the cracks in the silence had grown too wide to ignore. The social worker visited again, this time speaking with Daryl as well. Karen grew colder and more distant, spending long hours behind the closed bedroom door, while Daryl began to take small steps toward being present. He started eating dinner with Maya and Micah again, listening to their stories from school, even smiling faintly when Micah told silly jokes. It was awkward at first, but for Maya, it felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Fragile but warm, still the struggle was far from over. Karen's bitterness had not disappeared. It festered behind her silence, waiting for another chance to lash out. But Maya no longer felt powerless. Her notebook was safe in her hands. Her father's eyes had finally begun to open, and her own voice had broken through the walls. She knew the hardest battles were yet to come, but she also knew they were no longer fighting them in complete silence. And as she sat by Micah's bed one evening, holding his hand as he drifted to sleep, she whispered, "The walls are breaking, Micah. Soon they won't be able to hold us in." Breaking point. The days that followed were a strange mix of fear and quiet determination. At school, Maya felt herself blossoming in ways she could not show at home. She continued to write every night in her hidden notebook, filling page after page with thoughts, feelings, and even short speeches she imagined giving one day. Each word was like a piece of armor, protecting her from the sharpness of Karen's tongue and the weight of her father's silence. Ms. Johnson encouraged her more each week, praising her stories and gently reminding her that her voice could inspire others. Maya carried those words like light in her pocket, a secret flame she could take out whenever the world grew too dark. At home, however, the tension was rising. Karen had begun to notice that Maya's eyes no longer dropped to the floor so quickly, that her shoulders no longer slumped in complete defeat, and that her answers carried a hint of calmness instead of fear. It angered Karen in ways she could not explain. For a woman who thrived on control, any spark of resistance, even silent resistance, felt like a threat. She began to watch Maya more closely, snapping at her for the smallest things, accusing her of thinking she was too good, just because her teacher liked her. Daryl noticed these exchanges but said little, sometimes watching with furrowed brows but then retreating into the comfort of his drink and his silence. His absence in spirit hurt Maya more than any words Karen could throw. One evening, the breaking point arrived. Maya and Micah had been sitting at the kitchen table trying to finish their homework. Micah's handwriting was shaky, his small hand struggling to keep the pencil straight. Maya leaned closer, whispering encouragement. "You're doing fine, just take your time," she said softly. Karen walked in at that moment, her arms crossed, her face pinched with irritation. "What is this?" she demanded. "Why are you whispering like conspirators? You're plotting something, aren't you?" Maya froze for a moment, then took a slow breath. "No, ma'am. I was just helping Micah with his writing," she explained. Karen slammed her palm on the table, making the pencil roll to the floor. "Always making excuses. Always pretending you're some little mother. Maybe if you two acted right, I wouldn't have to keep this house in order." Something inside Maya shifted then. She felt Micah shrink beside her, his eyes filling with tears, and she realized she could no longer stay completely silent. Her heart pounded in her chest as she lifted her chin and spoke, her voice steady though her hands trembled under the table. "We are trying, ma'am. We are trying every day." Karen's eyes widened in shock, not used to hearing any words of defiance from the little girl. "Don't you dare talk back to me," she hissed, raising her hand slightly as if to strike. For a moment, the world held its breath, and then the bedroom door creaked open. Daryl stood in the doorway, his tie loosened, his face lined with exhaustion. He had heard the raised voices. His eyes moved from Karen's raised hand to Maya's defiant gaze, and then to Micah's trembling shoulders. The silence stretched between them all. Karen lowered her hand slowly, but her glare never softened. "Your daughter is learning to disrespect me," she spat. Daryl looked at Maya for a long moment, and though his lips parted, no words came out. Instead, he turned away, muttering, "We'll talk later," before retreating once again to the solitude of his room. The click of the bedroom door closing was louder than thunder in Maya's ears. Maya's chest burned with a mix of anger and sorrow. She had stood up for herself, just a little, and still, nothing had changed. She wanted to scream, to cry, to demand that her father see her, that he hear her, but the only sound that came out was her shaky breath. Karen sneered at her before storming out of the kitchen, leaving the siblings in stunned silence. Micah grabbed Maya's hand tightly, his voice trembling. "You're so brave," he whispered. Maya shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "No, Micah, I'm just tired of being quiet," she answered. That night, as the house grew still, Maya opened her notebook with trembling fingers. She wrote everything down, every moment, every feeling, but her words came out sharper than before. She no longer wrote only about survival. She wrote about change, about strength, about how silence could be broken. She filled 3 pages with words that poured out like fire, and when she was done, she looked at them and whispered, "This is mine. No one can take this from me." The next day at school, Ms. Johnson noticed the difference. Maya's eyes seemed brighter, her shoulders straighter when she handed in her work. Ms. Johnson leaned closer and said softly, "Maya, you have something powerful inside you. Don't be afraid to share it." Maya nodded slowly, her heart racing with the secret knowledge that she had already begun. She had already taken the first step toward breaking free from the chains of silence. That weekend, the school held a small assembly to announce upcoming events, and the storytelling contest was mentioned again. Maya felt her breath catch as she listened. She imagined herself standing on that stage, her words filling the room, her voice echoing in ears that would not ignore her. Fear gripped her, but excitement flickered too. For the first time, she wanted to be heard. She wanted the world to know that even a small girl in a quiet house could carry a voice stronger than silence. At home, Karen's suspicion only grew, but Maya's heart was changing. The breaking point had not destroyed her. It had woken something inside her, a strength she hadn't known she carried. And as she watched Micah sleeping peacefully that night, she whispered to herself that she would not stop. She would not remain invisible. The time was coming when her words would rise. Sparks of hope. The weeks that followed were heavy, but within the weight of everyday struggles, small sparks of light began to appear for Maya. School became more than just a place to sit at a desk and finish assignments. It became her refuge, a shelter from the storms that always brewed at home. In the classrooms, surrounded by chatter and laughter, she could pretend for a few hours that she was like every other child. In the hallways, she could walk without fear of sharp words waiting at every corner. And in the presence of Ms. Johnson, she found something even rarer, a quiet kind of belief that she was worthy of kindness. One Wednesday afternoon, when the last bell had rung and children spilled out of the building in noisy waves, Maya lingered in the classroom. Micah sat at the back desk coloring while Maya organized stacks of papers on the teacher's desk. Ms. Johnson watched her for a moment and then asked gently, "Maya, do you like to write?" Maya hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, ma'am," she whispered. Ms. Johnson smiled and placed a hand over the stack of papers. "Then never stop, Maya. Your words carry something important, something people need to hear." That moment etched itself deeply into Maya's heart. No one had spoken to her like that in years. No one had told her that her voice mattered at home. Those sparks of encouragement gave Maya a strength she hadn't felt before. When Karen snapped at her for forgetting to dry the dishes properly, Maya held Micah's hand tighter and whispered later that they would survive the day. When Daryl came home smelling of bourbon and looking past her as if she were invisible, Maya remembered Miss Johnson's words and told herself that she could still exist in the world, even if her father's silence tried to erase her. The notebook under her mattress filled with more sentences every night, words about courage, about hope, about promises she carved into paper because she had no place else to put them. Micah too began to notice the change in his sister. One evening, After Karen had sent them both to their room for being too noisy, while laughing over a silly drawing, Micah whispered, "You don't look so scared anymore." "Maya." She smiled faintly and brushed his hair back from his forehead. "I am still scared, Micah," she admitted. "But I think being brave means standing even when you are scared." Micah stared at her, his small eyes wide with wonder. To him, his sister wasn't just 9 years old. To him, she was a shield, a hero, someone who stood in front of storms with nothing but her willpower. One day at school, Micah spilled paint on his art project, and another boy laughed at him. Maya saw her brother's shoulders slump and his face redden with embarrassment. She stepped forward, defending him with a calm but firm voice. Telling the boy to stop, her words weren't loud, but there was power in them. Micah looked up at her with grateful eyes, and Ms. Johnson, who had been nearby, noticed again the quiet fire inside this young girl who carried herself as if she were much older than 9. Later that day, Ms. Johnson handed Maya a flyer about a storytelling contest the school was organizing. "I think you should try this," she said softly. "Your words deserve a stage." Maya took the flyer carefully, almost afraid to believe it was real. The idea of standing before people, of reading her thoughts aloud, terrified her, yet somewhere inside, a small part of her longed for it back at home. She tucked the flyer deep inside her notebook, afraid Karen might find it and tear it to shreds that evening. As she and Micah huddled under their thin blankets, she whispered to him about the contest. His eyes lit up. "You should do it, Maya. You always say the things I can't say." She shook her head, unsure if she had the courage, but Micah squeezed her hand and whispered back, "You are already brave, Maya. You just don't know it yet." His words echoed in her mind long after he fell asleep. The house remained the same, Karen's sharp voice cutting through walls, Daryl's silence filling the gaps. But within that environment, Maya began to change. She began to see herself not only as a victim of her circumstances, but as someone who could rise. Her diary pages became longer, her words sharper, more certain. She began to write stories not just about sadness, but about hope, about little girls who grew up strong, about brothers who found safety, about fathers who rediscovered their courage. Writing those stories was her way of building a world she wanted to live in, and each page became a stone in the foundation of the person she was becoming. Yet the more Maya grew in strength, the more Karen seemed to sense it. Her stepmother's eyes followed her with suspicion, as if she could smell defiance brewing. Whenever Maya answered too quickly or stood too straight, Karen accused her of trying to act better than she was. She made small, cutting remarks meant to crush the confidence that had started to bloom inside the child. Still, Maya clung to her secret notebook, her teacher's kind words and her brother's faith. She told herself that even if she was only 9 years old, she could choose to carry hope like a torch. On a particularly cold night, Micah woke from a nightmare, his little body shaking as he sobbed into Maya's arms. He dreamed that Karen had locked him outside in the freezing dark and no one came to open the door. Maya held him close, whispering again and again that it wasn't true, that she would never let that happen. He buried his face against her shoulder. "Promise?" he murmured, half asleep. She kissed the top of his head and whispered, "I promise, Micah, I will always be here. You are never alone." As his breathing slowed and he drifted back to sleep, Maya lay awake staring at the water-stained ceiling. She thought about the contest flyer hidden beneath her mattress. She thought about her words waiting in the notebook, and for the first time, she thought that maybe, just maybe, the world outside could hear her if she dared to speak. The father's silence. The morning after that long and heavy night, Maya woke up before the sun had fully risen. The air in the house was cold, and her thin blanket had done little to keep her warm. She carefully slid off the mattress on the floor, not wanting to wake Micah, who had curled tightly in his small bed with his Spider-Man blanket pulled up to his chin. His breathing was soft and steady, and for a brief moment, Maya felt peace as she watched him sleep. He always looked so innocent then, as if the world outside of his dreams had not yet touched him. But she knew the moment he opened his eyes, the weight of their life inside this house would press down on his small shoulders again. She brushed her fingers across his hair gently and whispered that everything would be fine. Even though she wasn't sure she believed it herself, when she stepped into the kitchen, the stale smell of last night's argument still lingered. The spoon from yesterday was gone, the counter had been wiped down, but the air carried the invisible marks of what had happened. She could hear Karen in the living room, her voice sharp as she spoke on the phone to one of her friends. Complaints about bills, about neighbors, about how much she sacrificed for a husband who came home tired, and children who didn't belong to her. Karen's words were knives that cut in every direction. Maya stayed quiet as she poured cereal into 2 chipped bowls. She knew better than to make any sound that might draw attention. In this house, silence was often the only shield she had. Daryl walked into the kitchen not long after. His tie was already knotted, though loosely, and his eyes were heavy as if he had not slept properly. He looked at Maya briefly, his gaze lingering for a second longer than usual, but then he dropped his eyes to the floor. He opened the cupboard, pulled out a mug, and poured himself coffee without saying a word. Maya's heart pounded. She wanted to ask him why he hadn't spoken last night, why he had walked away when she and Micah had needed him the most. But the words stuck in her throat. She knew that if she spoke, Karen might overhear and another storm would begin. So instead she kept her head down, stirring her cereal slowly, pretending not to notice the quiet war inside her father's tired eyes. At school, Maya found a strange kind of safety. The classrooms were noisy, filled with chatter, laughter, and the scrape of pencils on paper. And while most kids found it ordinary, Maya found it comforting. It was a kind of noise that didn't hurt, a kind of chaos that didn't leave marks. Ms. Johnson, her teacher, noticed how Maya always came early, always tried to be helpful, always kept Micah close when she could. Ms. Johnson had seen children like Maya before, children who carried responsibilities too big for their small hands. And though she never pried, her kindness was a light that Maya clung to. That day when Maya handed in her writing assignment, Ms. Johnson smiled and said, "You have a gift, Maya. Don't ever stop writing your thoughts." The words sank deep into Maya's heart. It was the first time in a long time someone had told her she was good at something, and she tucked that moment away like a secret treasure. When Maya returned home that afternoon, the air inside the house felt heavier again. Karen was standing in the hallway, arms crossed, her eyes sharp and calculating. "Where were you?" she demanded. Even though she knew they had just come from school, Maya explained softly that she had stayed a few minutes longer because Ms. Johnson had asked her to help organize papers. Karen shook her head, muttering that Maya was trying to act better than she was, trying to get attention she didn't deserve. Micah clutched Maya's hand tightly, his small fingers squeezing as if he needed to remind her that he was there. Maya wanted to answer back, to say something, to defend herself, but she remembered the sting of the spatula and the sound of her father's silence. So she bowed her head and guided Micah quietly to their room. That night, as Micah slept, Maya pulled out an old notebook she had hidden beneath the mattress. Its pages were worn, its cover bent, but to her it was a doorway to something better. She began to write, not in big fancy words, but in the plain words her heart could manage. She wrote about the way the house felt heavy, about the way her stepmother's words cut into her skin even when no hand was raised, about the way her father's silence hurt more than the anger. She wrote about her promise to Micah, that one day they would be free, and though her hand trembled as she pressed the pencil across the paper, something inside her steadied. For the first time, she felt as if her thoughts belonged to her, as if her voice was real, even if no one else heard it. The pages became her secret world, her silent cry made visible, and in the dim glow of the night, she whispered to herself that she would keep writing until one day her words could not be ignored. The kitchen silenced Maya was only 9, but her small shoulders carried more weight than many adults could imagine. The house was quiet, but not the peaceful kind of quiet. It was the kind of silence that made every sound feel sharp and dangerous. The ticking of the clock on the kitchen wall sounded like a hammer. The drip of the faucet felt like thunder. And even the sound of Micah breathing beside her seemed too loud. Her brother was only 5. His Spider-Man pajama shirt was wrinkled and stretched at the bottom from him, nervously tugging at it. He stood near the trash can, trying to make himself invisible. His eyes were wide, shining with fear and confusion. He never understood why such small accidents at home always turned into storms. A spoon had clattered to the floor a few minutes earlier. It wasn't much, just a spoon. the kind of thing most families would laugh about. But in this house, nothing was small. Everything could turn into fire. Karen, their stepmother, stood over them. Her pale face twisted with irritation. She held a spatula in her hand, the plastic still wet with soap from the sink. Her lips pressed thin, her eyes sharp. She towered above Maya, not just in height but in presence. She made the room feel smaller, tighter, harder to breathe. "You two never learn," Karen snapped. Her voice was sharp like broken glass. "Always careless, always clumsy. Do you think spoons grow on trees? Do you think messes clean themselves?" Maya felt Micah's eyes on her. She felt the tremble in his body even though he wasn't touching her. She knew what he was thinking. He was waiting for her to step forward, waiting for her to shield him, and she did. Because that was what Maya always did. "It was me," Maya whispered. Her voice trembled, but she forced it steady. "I dropped it, not Micah. It was my fault." Karen's eyes narrowed. The spatula tapped against her palm. "Lying now, too? You think I don't see? You think I don't know?" Before Maya could answer, the spatula swung through the air. It smacked against the counter instead of her skin. But the sound was enough to make Micah flinch and whimper. Karen's head snapped toward him. "Stop making that noise," she hissed. "You sound like a dying dog." Maya clenched her teeth. She couldn't cry, she couldn't show fear. Not today, not in front of him. She had to stand even if she felt small inside. The front door creaked open then. All three froze. Bootsteps echoed across the hardwood floor. Heavy, tired, uneven, Maya knew that rhythm, Daddy. Section 2. The father's return. Daryl stepped into the entryway. His briefcase dangled from one hand. His tie was loose, his shirt wrinkled. He smelled of long hours and cheap bourbon, the kind of smell that meant he had been gone too long and thinking too much. His eyes swept the room slowly. First they landed on Karen, then drifted to Maya, who stood frozen near the table, and finally to Micah, who had pressed himself against the trash can like it could protect him. "What's going on?" Daryl asked. His voice was flat, heavy with exhaustion. Karen's expression shifted in an instant. Her face softened, her tone lightened as if a switch had been flipped. "The kids were being careless again," she said smoothly. "Spilled juice, broke a spoon, I had to raise my voice." Daryl's gaze lingered. His eyes flicked back to Maya's cheek, where the skin was still pink from where the spatula had nearly struck. He noticed the way Maya's hands clenched into fists at her side. He noticed the way Micah trembled, but after a long moment he said nothing. "We'll talk later," he muttered instead, and then walked past them, past Karen, past his daughter's pleading eyes and his son's silent fear. The door to the bedroom clicked shut behind him. Micah whimpered softly. Maya swallowed the sound that rose in her throat. She didn't know what stung more, Karen's sharp words or her father's silence. Section 3. Night whispers. Later that night, Maya helped Micah wash his hands and brush his teeth. The boy leaned against her, his small head pressing against her shoulder as if he needed her to hold him upright. She tied his blanket around him like a cape, though it was too thin to fight the autumn cold creeping through the window cracks. "You were brave," Micah whispered. His voice was small, almost lost in the hum of the old bathroom light. "No," Maya said softly, "I was just louder." Micah nodded, as if that made sense to him. He didn't understand yet. He didn't see how much weight his sister carried, how her small frame was the only shield he had in this house. She tucked him into bed and curled up on the thin mattress on the floor beside him. The ceiling above had a water stain shaped like a question mark. She stared at it until her eyes blurred. She remembered when this house used to sound different, when music filled the air, when her mother hummed while cooking, when her father's deep voice sang in the shower. Now the silence pressed on her chest like a stone. Still, she whispered a promise to Micah as his breathing slowed into sleep. "One day we'll be free."